The rain over the Cornish coast did not fall, it possessed. It was a relentless, grey invasion that blurred the jagged edges of Blackwood Tor, turning the Atlantic into a churning cauldron of lead and silver. Inside the manor, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the ancient, exhaled breath of damp stone. Elara Penhaligon stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of the master suite, her reflection a pale ghost superimposed over the storm. She was draped in ivory silk that felt less like a wedding gown and more like a shroud. The fabric was cold. It clung to her collarbones, tracing the hollows of a throat that felt perpetually constricted. In her mind, the day's events played back in a series of muted, sepia-toned frames, the hollow resonance of the vows in the chapel at St. Endelion, the dry touch of a gold band sliding onto her finger, and the weight of the Vance family diamonds heavy, glacial and transactional. This was the transaction. Her father's debts, sprawling like a gangrenous map across the Penhaligon estate, had been cauterized by a single signature. The man who owned that signature was now her husband, Alistair Vance. In the city of London, they called him the Cenobite of commerce. He was a man of sterile habits and predatory patience, a financier who lived on a diet of mineral water, steamed greens, and the silent accumulation of broken companies. Rumours clung to him of webs in an abandoned cathedral, that he had taken a vow of celibacy during the youthful tragedies, that he found the touch of another human being to be a form of sensory pollution. He was the vegetarian CEO, a man who had successfully starved his soul of any appetite that didn't involve a ledger. Elara heard the heavy oak door groan on its hinges. She didn't turn. The click of the latch was a finality, a bolt sliding home in a cell she had decorated herself. "The wind is particularly violent tonight," Alistair's voice remarked. It was a baritone of exquisite neutrality, polished and devoid of the jagged edges of emotion. Elara watched his reflection join hers in the glass. He had discarded his suit jacket. In his white shirt, he looked unnervingly lean, a study in monochrome. His face was a landscape of sharp lines and shadows, his eyes the color of the sea just before a gale unreadable and deep. "It sounds like it wants to get in," Elara whispered, her voice catching on the jagged edges of her own nerves. "It sounds like it wants to tear the house down." Blackwood Tor has stood for 400 years, Elara. It is indifferent to the weather, much like the people who survive in it. He moved to the sideboard, pouring a glass of water. No wine, no celebratory champagne. The liquid was clear, honest, and utterly devoid of warmth. He held the glass with fingers that were long and steady, the hands of a surgeon or a marksman. "He's looking at me as if I am a complicated piece of machinery," Elara thought, an acquisition that must be calibrated. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of resentment. She was 26, a woman of blood and bone and unspoken poems, and she had been sold to a man who treated his pulse as a distraction. She turned away from the window, the silk of her skirts hissing against the Persian rug. "Is this the part where we discuss the terms?" she asked, her courage flickering like a candle in a draught. "The wedding night transaction my father was so keen to facilitate. You have the land. You have the Penhaligon name. What is it you want from the girl who came with the deed?" Alistair set the glass down. The sound was a sharp clack in the silence. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, Elara saw a fracture in the ice of his composure. It wasn't desire, not yet, but a profound, weary recognition. "I am a man of habits, Elara," he said softly, walking towards her. He stopped just outside the circle of her scent, sandalwood and anxiety. "I have spent 15 years perfecting a life of absence. I do not eat meat because I dislike the idea of consuming death. I do not drink because I value the clarity of my own misery. And I have not touched a woman because I did not wish to be responsible for the inevitable gravity of another person's expectations." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird. "And yet, you bought me. I saved you," he corrected, his voice dropping an octave. "There is a difference. But in doing so, I find I have disturbed the vacuum I worked so hard to create. You are remarkably loud, even when you are silent." He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, a surprising, living warmth that contradicted his reputation. "They call you the man who doesn't hunger," she breathed, her eyes searching his. "But you're looking at me as if you're starving." Alistair's jaw tightened. The metaphor struck home, a needle piercing a nerve. For years, he had lived in a self-imposed winter, believing that by denying the body, he could protect the mind from the chaos of feeling. He had built an empire on the philosophy of the void. But standing in this room, with the scent of rain-drenched earth and the shimmering vulnerability of the woman before him, the void was beginning to scream. The vegetarian was waking up to a hunger that no amount of discipline could suppress. "The transaction," he said, his voice now raspy, "was supposed to be a formality, a legal binding to ensure the stability of the holdings. But you are not a holding, Elara. You are a disruption." He stepped closer, closing the distance. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the static of the storm outside. Elara didn't pull away. She felt a strange, intoxicating power in his admission. This man, who controlled markets and moved mountains of capital, was vibrating with a suppressed energy that felt like a tectonic plate on the verge of slipping. "Then disrupt me, Alistair," she challenged, her voice a mere thread of sound. "Break your fast. Or are you afraid that if you start to feel, you won't be able to stop?" The silence that followed was a bridge of glass. Alistair's hand finally made contact. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, as if he were rediscovering the texture of the world after a long blindness. Elara gasped, the sensation of his skin against hers sending a jolt through her that felt like lightning striking the door. "I have spent my life avoiding the fire," he murmured, his eyes darkening to a turbulent charcoal. "Because I knew that, if I ever let it catch, I would burn the world down just to keep it lit." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You think tonight is a transaction? No, tonight is a surrender, and I am not sure which one of us is the victor." Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, a wave crashing against the cliffs with the force of a falling star. Inside, the vegetarian CEO leaned down and kissed his bride, a slow, tentative exploration that quickly deepened into a desperate, parched reclaiming of life. It was the taste of forbidden fruit, of salt and silk, and the terrifying, beautiful end of a long, cold peace. The transaction was void. The hunger had begun. The kiss was not an act of grace. It was a structural failure. To Alistair Thorne, who had spent a decade and a half constructing a psyche out of cold flint and calculated distance, the touch of Elara's lips felt like the first hairline fracture in a dam. He had cultivated a reputation for being bloodless, a man who viewed the world through the sterile lens of a balance sheet. Yet here he was, drowning in the sudden, violent surge of his own pulse. He pulled back, but only by an inch. The air between them was scorched, thin and tasting of ozone. His thumb remained anchored to the delicate curve of her jaw, his skin humming with a frantic, rhythmic heat. In the flickering amber light of the library, a room filled with the leather-bound ghosts of better men, he looked at her and felt the terrifying weight of his own hypocrisy. He had told himself he was a protector. He had told the board of directors, the solicitors in Truro, and the weeping creditors of the Penhaligon estate that his interest in this marriage was purely custodial. He was the cold-blooded architect of a legacy, acquiring a wife as one might acquire a rare, fragile manuscript to be preserved, not read. But as he looked into Elara's eyes, which were the dark, turbulent green of the Atlantic off the cliffs of Tintagel, he realized he had lied to every soul in Cornwall, most of all himself. "I am a man of habits," he thought, the words echoing like a mantra against the rising panic in his chest. "I do not consume. I do not deplete. I am the observer." Yet, the sensory reality of her was shattering his asceticism. She smelled of rain and something deeper, the scent of gorse honey and the ancient, salt-heavy earth of the moor. It was a visceral, uncurated fragrance that bypassed his intellect and struck straight at the primitive core he had tried so hard to starve into submission. Elara watched the play of shadows across his face. She saw the way his pupils dilated, swallowing the grey of his irises until he looked less like a businessman and more like the wolves her grandfather used to warn her about, the ones that waited in the long shadows of the St. Nate Woods. She felt a strange, shimmering clarity. 4 years, she had been a pawn, a piece of the Penhaligon land to be bartered, but in this moment of Alistair's collapse, she felt a jagged sense of agency. "You're shaking," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattling of the sash windows. Alistair's hand dropped from her face, his fingers curling into a fist, as if trying to catch the remnants of her warmth. "I have lived a very long time in the dark, Elara. I had forgotten that light has a temperature." He turned away from her, walking toward the tall, arched window that overlooked the rain-slicked gardens of Blackwood Manor. Outside, the storm was stripping the leaves from the oaks, a chaotic redistribution of energy that mirrored the upheaval within his own ribcage. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. "My father died of his hungers," Alistair said, his voice regaining some of its flinty edge, though it remained frayed at the borders. "He was a man of vast appetites for spirits, for women, for the roar of a crowd. He consumed everything until there was nothing left but ash and a mountain of debt. I looked at the wreckage of his life and decided I would be the opposite. I would be the vacuum. I would be the man who needed nothing." He looked over his shoulder at her, his expression a mask of weary brilliance. "But you are not a nothing. You are a profound, inconvenient something, and I find that 15 years of discipline is a very poor shield against the way you look at me." Elara moved toward him, her silk gown whispering against the Persian rug a sound like dry grass in the wind. She didn't stop until she was standing just behind him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his shoulders like a physical force. "You think of yourself as a void, Alistair," she said softly, "but a void doesn't fight this hard to stay empty. You aren't avoiding hunger. You're terrified of what you'll become if you're ever full." She reached out, her hand hovering over the small of his back, not quite touching him. The air seemed to thicken, turning to honey. "The transaction was for my name and my land. You have those, but you didn't buy my silence. And you certainly didn't buy my pity. If you want to spend the rest of your life starving in a house this beautiful, that is your choice. But don't pretend it's for my sake." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the hallway, a sound like a heart beating in a hollow chest. Alistair closed his eyes. He thought of the empty rooms of his life, the pristine, white-walled galleries of his London offices, the silent dinners, the calculated solitude. It had been a masterpiece of control, and yet, standing here in the wild, salt-sprayed dark of Cornwall, it felt like a tomb. The vegetarian, the man who refused to touch the messiness of life, felt a sudden, agonizing thirst for the very thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He wanted the chaos, he wanted the heat, he wanted the terrifying gravity of being known by the woman standing behind him. He turned around slowly, his movements deliberate, like a man stepping onto thin ice. He didn't speak. He reached out and took her hands in his. They were small, cold, and possessed of a strength that surprised him. "If I break my fast, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "there will be no going back to the stillness. Do you understand that? I do not know how to want things in moderation. I have lived in moderation my entire life," she replied, her eyes defiant, shimmering with a reflected spark from the dying fire. "I am tired of being careful. I am tired of being a holding. If we are to be a catastrophe, Alistair, then let's at least be a spectacular one." He looked at her for a long beat, the ice in his soul finally, irrevocably giving way to the thaw. Outside, the storm broke, the rain turning into a steady, rhythmic pulse against the stone. Inside, Alistair Thorne, the man who needed nothing, leaned down and began to take everything. The kiss this time was different. It wasn't an exploration. It was a surrender. It was the sound of a wall falling, the smell of the first rain on parched earth, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that some hungers can never be satisfied, only fed. He lifted her, her silk skirts cascading over his arms like a waterfall, and as he carried her toward the stairs, the transaction was forgotten, replaced by a contract written in breath, skin, and the wild, unyielding dark of the Cornish night. The void was no longer screaming. It was finally, for the first time in 15 years, beginning to breathe. The stairs of Blackwood Manor were a spine of ancient, unyielding oak, and as Alistair ascended them with Elara in his arms, every groan of the wood felt like a protest from his former self. For 15 years, he had been a man of straight lines and cold surfaces, a creature of mathematical precision who viewed human emotion as a structural flaw. Now, the weight of her, the warmth of her skin through the silk, the rhythmic puff of her breath against the hollow of his throat was a chaotic variable that threatened to collapse the entire architecture of his life. He felt a terrifying fragility in his own limbs. It was not that she was heavy, but rather that his own resolve had turned to glass. He was acutely aware of the dust motes dancing in the dim amber light of the sconces, the way the shadows of the banisters striped his skin, and the bars of a cage he was finally stepping out of. Inside his mind, the silence he had cultivated so carefully was being replaced by a low, thrumming resonance, a sound like a cello string held at breaking point. They reached the upper landing, a gallery of portraits where the Thorne ancestors stared down with eyes of oil and varnish. Alistair did not look at them. He knew their histories, the drunkards, the gamblers, the men who had swallowed the world and choked on it. He had spent his adulthood running from their shadows, building a fortress of nothing to escape their everything. But as he carried Elara into the master suite room that had always felt more like a museum than a sanctuary, he realized that his father's gluttony and his own starvation were merely two sides of the same coin. Both were ways of avoiding the terrifying, balanced truth of being alive. He set her down beside the vast, four-poster bed, but he did not pull away. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sea salt and old wood, seasoned by the dying embers in the hearth. Elara stood her ground, her gaze never wavering, a steady flame in the drafty expanse of his isolation. "You're shaking," she whispered, her voice a soft friction that seemed to peel back the last of his skin. "I am a man being dismantled," Alistair replied, his voice a ragged shadow of its usual baritone. He looked at his hands, the hands that signed contracts, that managed millions, that held the steering wheels of fast cars and the stems of expensive glasses. They looked foreign to him now. "I have spent so long fearing the fire that I forgot the cold could also kill. I thought I was preserving myself, Elara. I thought I was keeping the world clean by refusing to touch it." He reached out, his fingertips tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that bordered on pain. The internal monologue that had governed him for a decade, the constant, cynical tally of risks and rewards, had finally fallen silent. In its place was a visceral, aching presence. He felt the pull of the earth, the gravity of another soul, a force so powerful it made his previous life of discipline look like a child's game of make-believe. "The vegetarian is dead," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The metaphor felt heavy, a stone cast into a deep, still pool. He had defined himself by what he didn't do, what he didn't feel, what he didn't want. To want was to be vulnerable, to need was to be broken. And yet, looking at the curve of her shoulder, the defiance in her eyes, he felt a wholeness that no amount of nothing could ever provide. Outside, the Cornish wind howled against the granite walls of the manor, a wild, elemental scream that echoed the upheaval within his chest. The storm was no longer an enemy to be shuttered out. It was a reflection of the thaw. The ice was breaking, jagged and loud, and Alistair Thorne was drowning in the meltwater. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. The darkness behind his lids was no longer a void. It was a space waiting to be filled. He thought of the land he had bought, the Penhaligon acres that stretched down to the jagged teeth of the Atlantic. He had wanted it for its silence, for its emptiness. He realized now he had wanted it, because it was the only thing as lonely as he was. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, the confession costing him more than any financial empire ever could. "I don't know how to inhabit a space with someone else without trying to own it, or hide from it." Elara reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer until there was no distance left for lies. "Then don't think," she said. "For once in your life, Alistair, don't calculate the cost. Just be the catastrophe." And in the quiet of the Zena night, as the rain turned to mist and the moon struggled to pierce the clouds, the man who needed nothing finally reached out and took the risk of needing everything. The transaction was over. The life of Alistair Thorne, the ascetic of London, had ended at the top of a creaking staircase in Cornwall. What remained was a man, stripped of his armor, standing in the ruins of his own control, finally learning the language of the hunger he had spent a lifetime trying to starve. He was no longer a vacuum. He was a vessel, and for the first time in 15 years, he was beginning to overflow. The word catastrophe hung in the salt-thickened air of the bedroom, a jagged shard of glass that Alistair Thorne found himself unable to step around. He had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting the art of the architectural stillness, a life constructed with the precision of a watchmaker, where every gear was lubricated by the absence of desire. He had been a man of glass and steel, transparent yet impenetrable. But as Elara's fingers tightened against the skin of his neck, he felt the first hairline fractures, spider webbing across the surface of his soul. The silence that followed was not the hollow quiet of his London townhouse, nor the antiseptic hush of a boardroom. It was the heavy, expectant silence of the moor outside, the breath held between the crashing of waves against the Zena cliffs. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, he did not see the spreadsheets of his losses or the spectral face of his father gorging on the spoils of a ruined reputation. Instead, he saw the Penhaligon land as it truly was, not a buffer against the world, but a wild, unmanicured theatre of endurance. He felt the gravity of her presence, pulling at the very marrow of his bones. To stay standing was an act of defiance against the universe itself. To fall was the only honest thing left to do. Alistair let out a breath he felt he had been holding since he was 12 years old. It was a ragged, shuddering sound, the noise of a machine finally grinding to a halt. He leaned into her, not with the practiced grace of a lover, but with the desperate, clumsy weight of a drowning man reaching for a spar of driftwood. The internal monologue that had been his constant companion, that cold, analytical voice that whispered caution, distance, safety, was being drowned out by the roar of his own blood. It was a terrifying cacophony. He felt the vast, empty rooms of his heart beginning to resonate with a frequency he didn't recognize. It was the sound of the thaw. It was the sound of the granite of his personality being ground into sand by the relentless tide of another human being's need. "I have been a ghost," he whispered against her hair, the words tasting like copper and ash. "I thought if I didn't want anything, I couldn't lose anything. I thought the hunger was a flaw in the design." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his grey eyes searching her face as if memorizing a map for a country he was entering without a passport. He saw the flecks of gold in her irises, the slight tremor in her own lip, the sheer, terrifying reality of her. She was not a concept. She was not a risk to be mitigated. She was a person, and she was looking at him if he were something worth salvaging from the wreckage. The metaphor of the vegetarian, that brittle, self-imposed starvation, shattered completely. He realized now that his father's gluttony had been a desperate attempt to fill a void, but his own asceticism had been the void itself. He had been a vacuum, defined only by what he excluded. But as he reached out and took Elara's hand, his thumb tracing the delicate pulse in her wrist, he felt the vacuum collapse. The room seemed to expand. The scent of the dying fire, the smoky, resinous ghost of oak logs mingled with the sharp, ozone tang of the storm leaking through the window frames. He felt the texture of the air, the weight of the duvet, the solid, unyielding floor beneath his feet. He was no longer hovering above his life. He was being dragged down into the thick of it. "The catastrophe," he murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, though it felt more like a scar opening. "It's not the falling apart, is it? It's the coming together. It's the terrifying weight of being known." Elara didn't answer with words. She simply leaned forward and pressed her mouth to his, a gesture that was neither a beginning nor an end, but a bridge. In that contact, Alistair felt the last of his defenses dissolve. The nothing he had cultivated, the pristine, white-walled gallery of his existence was being flooded with color. Messy and vibrant and overwhelming. He thought of the Atlantic outside. The way it hammered at the Cornish coast, year after year, century after century. The land didn't resist the sea. It was shaped by it. The jagged cliffs were not signs of defeat, but of a long, violent, beautiful conversation. He was the cliff, and she was the sea. As the night deepened over Zena, the man who had sought to be an island found himself part of the mainland again. The transaction was indeed over. There were no more ledgers to balance, no more shadows to outrun. There was only the heat of another person in the dark, the rhythmic pulse of two lives intersecting in a house built of stone and salt. Alistair Thorne lay back, pulling her with him into the depths of the shadows, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't check the time, didn't calculate the exit strategy, and didn't fear the morning. He let the hunger in. He let the world overflow. And as the storm finally broke, and the rain softened into a gentle, rhythmic tapping against the glass, the ascetic of London fell into a sleep that was no longer an escape, but a rest. He was no longer a man of glass. He was a man of earth, and for the first time, he was home.